Hello, hello. Welcome back to another episode of Deploy Friday. My name's Chad Carlson from Platform.sh. I'm joined today as my co-host, Paul Gilzow here. Hey, Paul.
Hello.
Today we're going to be talking a little bit about local development, specifically with Lando. And our guests today joining us are Alec. Let me get your last name up here on the sheet. It's Alec Reynolds. That's what I thought. Hey, Alec.
Reynolds rap family fortune, it's barely even have to work, right?
Thanks. And also Mike Pirog. How are you doing, Mike?
I was good until I just apparently learned that Alec is the heir of the Reynolds rap fortune. And I'm wondering why I've been working too.
Very few worries. Well, thank you both.
Foil.
Yeah,
and aluminum foil. Thank you all for joining us. Like I said, we're going to be talking a little bit about Lando and local development. Maybe we could take a moment for you each to introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Alec Reynolds, and I am one of the co-founders of Lando and Tandem, which we can talk a little bit about the history of both organizations, I guess, in a second. But I despite popular belief and opinion, I am not, in fact, the heir to the Reynolds rap fortune. Sorry, Mike.
Unfortunately.
Yep. I'm Mike Pirog. I'm the other co-founder of both Tandem and Lando.
Right on. So yeah, if we start off, what is Tandem and how long have you two been working together, and what made you get into local development as a problem to focus on in the establishment of Lando?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the first part of that question, and then Mike, you can talk a little bit more about why we stuck our foot into development environments in general, because you've definitely spent many years there. But yeah, Mike and I we met each other, I think, like in late 2011. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was like mid 2011 or so. So it's been over 10 years now. And we actually founded an agency called Calamuna back in 2012, which some of you may know. They're still kicking around, doing a great job out there, mostly in the Drupal space. Spent a few years growing that agency, was really proud of what we did. And then we saw this sort of other thing with this little product called Calabox that some listeners might remember from the days of yore. We decided we wanted to pursue that a little bit more and created this agency called Tandem. And we're actually, Tandem's sort of in its last stages. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a second. But we've been having a really exciting time focusing on Lando. And Mike, I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about how we got into Calabox and Lando and this whole crazy thing that we're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to summarize the last 10 years of effort in this space. But very early on at Calamuna, we realized that it was like difficult for developers to sort of like get started working on things and to stay productive over time. So we started solving those problems ourselves, just for our agency and our use case. And then over the course of 10 years, that snowballed into more and more people also feeling this problem and looking for a solution and like trying our stuff to like sort of solve their problem. So, over the last 10 years, it's gone from basically like a very niche Drupal product, open source project called Calabox, which was a few different agencies had sort of adopted at the time, and I think there's like maybe a few hundred active users, to now where we have something that supports like a large percentage of like PHP use cases and outside of PHP as well. And there's, mid 10,000, I think like 14 or 15,000 people a month now using it. So it's been a long road, but that's the road goes on forevermore. But that's where we are on the road right now.
Okay. What's the relationship between Lando and Docker, at least? How does Lando work, and what's the relationship between Docker?
Yeah, so I think various people, I think for good reasons have described Lando as like a Docker plus solution, which is to say that it like takes Docker and extends it in some sort of way, or shores up maybe something that Docker is lacking. We like sort of resent that classification, because to us, like Docker is like basically an implementation detail. When we were making Lando, Docker was sort of the best thing for us to use to make Lando work the way that we wanted it to. So we used it. That like may not always be true. maybe at some point there's something better than Docker. So we look at Docker basically the same way as we look at, Node or some like Node library that we also use in Lando, which like this is an implementation detail. At the time it was the best tool for the job. That might not always be true. So
I do remember excitedly telling Mike about Docker for the first time. And it changed our lives. But I think there is like a more complex landscape out there. And I don't know, I don't know what you all think, but clearly Docker as a company has taken like a lot of different turns and is kind of in the middle of another one right now. So certainly I feel like I'm very glad that the problem we're solving is not one that's we're not solving like a Docker problem, right? We're solving a bigger problem than that,
right.
Yeah,
and I think it's like, the big leap for us in our journey of making development tools was the jump from basically a static VM that you spin up that powers all your sites to like the promise of containers, which now allows each one of your projects to have separate dependencies. I mean, much like Platform.sh itself is designed. So that was the big leap at the time, was going from VMs to containers. And at the time, it basically was like, you can either do it directly with like LXC containers or you can use Docker. And we were like, thanks, we'll use Docker. But that was quite a while ago. So things have changed. And I think it's also important to like recognize that like, Docker is not a development. I mean, you can use Docker for development, but I don't think that like I would describe Docker as like a development tool. I mean, like they might be saying that they are that now, and maybe they're moving more in that direction. But like initially, this was like a tool basically to just wrap around containers and spin them up. I think presumably with the intention of like powering hosting and infrastructure, which is like a very similar problem to like the problems of development, but is definitely not the same problem. So I think it's important to like highlight that as well.
Well, kind of going off that, what was it about local development that you were really focused in on trying to fix? Like instead of just saying, here's some Docker Compose files you can go use. What was the internal problem you were seeing where you're like, we need to build what ended up being Lando?
Yeah, so I think there's a few answers there. I mean, one, we don't conceptualize. We don't think that Lando itself is a local development tool. We just think it's a development tool. It just so happens that like many people use it locally to do development. That's where we're doing a lot of development. That also is changing. I think there's even some. We'll probably talk about that during the podcast a little bit. But less people are working locally for development. But yeah, so I mean, we think mainly that Lando is trying to solve the development problem, not necessarily the local development problem. But local is a huge part of that. As it relates to like the sort of the feature set that Lando has over just like doing like Docker Compose by itself, like. Again, like to highlight the difference, like Docker Compose is not necessarily a tool for development. You can use it for development. So there's a whole bunch of things that like I think that Lando does for you that like Docker Compose doesn't do. The most important one is probably just like simplifying the whole thing. If you want to make your own Docker Compose file, especially for like a complicated situation, it takes a lot of effort to do that. And there's more considerations that you'd have to make, like how do I handle permission mapping correctly? Like how do I network my containers together in a way that makes sense for local development? How do I like do SSH keys? How do I do like file sharing? All these things are also very relevant questions. So I think those are the main things. And like I feel like that should resonate for people who use Platform.sh. Because it's like, yeah, I mean, you could also just like use Docker Compose and like do your project that way, But like a lot of people have decided like, no, I don't want to do that. I'd rather use, I find that Platform's configuration system speaks to me deeply, and like that's what I want to use. And I think ease of use is the primary reason for people making that choice.
That makes sense.
I think like one piece too I would throw out there, that attracted us to the problem of just development environments in general was more of the process and workflow side of things, where it's like there's a big difference between just having your infrastructure as code, which is sort of the problem that Docker solves. I mean, there's lots of solutions for that problem, right? Like that's sort of a solved problem. Obviously, we use Docker. Probably in the future, we'll use a variety of different things even to solve that problem. But it's not like that problem of getting a developer from zero to completely ready to actually do stuff. That's more of a procedural problem where it's like, okay, I need to actually get this person spun up with their website. They need to actually understand how to push code, how to pull down code.
Right.
And it's not just code, it's databases and files, other assets. There's a lot of things that you have to do that should really be automatable processes that should work the same way on every project you work on, particularly in an agency context where you're working on so many projects at the same time. That right now they're not. It's it's in the README. It's not in a single command. And I think that's the exciting stuff I see with Lando is like, yeah, we've actually consolidated a lot of that stuff down into a Lando pull or a Lando test or what have you.
Yeah, another way to say it too is that especially over the last couple of years, like the ops part of DevOps has just like gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and on a per project basis has gotten significantly different. And like I think that trend will continue. I mean, like our apps are getting more complicated. The time that we're spending doing that part is getting a lot bigger. But that's like not really why I think a lot of like professional developers are doing this. There are some people who enjoy that part of the equation, but like most people are just like, I have to do this work, and the work is solidly in the dev part of DevOps. It's not in the ops part of DevOps. So like we really think as Lando as a solution that like basically just becomes the ops part of it, or kills the ops part of it if you prefer that sort of thinking around it. Which is that like why we shouldn't be spending all this time. We should be going back to like the time where we spend most of our time actually doing the development and not the ops. So we see Lando as basically the replacement of like the ops part of DevOps. Just like stop spending all your time doing this. Like we can do this. Like we have the tools to be able to do this. I think like a good analogy is like if you're making pasta, it's like, are you engaging in cook ops? Are you like going out and plowing the field and growing the wheat so you can make the spaghetti? It's like, no, you're not, because like, why would you do that? Unless you're sort of a like hobbyist or like running a spaghetti factory, like why are you doing that part of the ops? So we think of Lando as sort of like that. It's like, why are we still doing this? We don't have to be doing this. So that's really the thing. And like, as Alec said, like infrastructure as code is definitely a huge part of that, but it's not the only part of that. It's actually the part of it that is the most well done so far. Like there are many ways that you can do it, but there's a whole other slew of things that are important for ops, which is like the workflow and process stuff that he was talking about.
Is that what sets Lando apart from some of the other potentially built on top of Docker local dev solutions that are out there?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things. I think that if I were to say, I think the biggest differentiators between Lando and some of the other like perceived competitors, although we don't necessarily think of them as competitors, are that like the amount of different projects that you can run with Lando. I think that's like one of its biggest benefits is like, if you want to run a very complicated application that has like very weird stuff going on in it, like generally you can figure out how to do that in Lando. I think that like helps quite a bit because ultimately the goal is like complete standardization across all the members of your team and all of its projects. So like, it's very difficult to do that. It's like, I certainly wouldn't make the claim that Lando can do that for all people in all circumstances, but like, it's certainly like, I think it's one of the best things to allow you to do that and to do it pretty easily. So I think that's a big part of it. But yeah, then I think that the sort of like workflow as code part of it is one of it too. And the relationship that we have with Platform is a great example of that. But yeah, that's something that's true for the other parts of Lando as well. I think that our ability to like set, I think, very easy defaults for things that people can just run with, but then like having the ability to customize basically down to like whatever level you want to is also, I think, like another pretty big feature of it.
Sure. It's funny if you want to know a silly aspect of that too, because I talk to a lot of our users and oftentimes I'll ask them like, what's special about Lando? Like what's different? And like all the things Mike said are like the really fundamental parts of that. But one of the silly things I always hear that I think is actually kind of important increasingly as I like kind of go on in the journey with Lando. And I'm like, yeah, this is pretty important. They're like, yeah, we just like the attitude. We like that you put in silly stuff in the CLI, that you're not just like every boring dev tool that's out there.
Yes.
Literally, they'll be like, we like the boom shakalaka.
Yes.
When you start up the site. Like, that's what they like.
Yes. No,
I mean, I like that too. Like, that's awesome.
Before I worked for Platform, I worked for a different place, and we used at the previous employer, for 3 years, starting in 2018, we standardized on Lando. And that was one of the first things a new dev would always say is like, did you put this in there, this boom shakalaka? Like, no. What about this cooking with fire? What is all this? Why is it Lando? I see a Leia and a Bespin and all these Star Wars references. So yeah, I think that's really well received.
I mean, I came back into Mike. You would like this. Like I was running some tests. I was doing some work on Lando, and I came back into my office, and there's just this big "uh-oh" in red letters on my screen, and I almost like just took out my phone and took a picture of it, just because it was such a perfect moment of like, yeah, that's how I feel when like this thing fails.
It goes that way. It's like, how did you end up on the name Lando? I don't think we asked that question.
It was like the it was like the project code name when we were working on like what at the time was going to be Calabox 3, and we couldn't think of anything better, so it stuck. Yeah. So it wasn't supposed to be Lando. It was supposed to be, I don't know, TBD, I guess.
It's sort of ironic because my wife is also a software engineer, and the company she was working at the time, like completely separately, came up with a Lando project, and it would infuriate me every time I heard her talking about Lando, because I'm like, you guys copied us, definitely took that name and
stole it from us.
Yeah,
of course.
We did spend a weird amount of time like researching, the trademark copyright potential violations. Because apparently the mouse has his hand on the lawsuit trigger. It's very itchy. So we did some research into like, okay, like what of these things can we use? Like what can't we use? Let's just be careful. But Lando itself apparently is completely fine. It is just a name. So.
Mike, you were talking a little bit about standardizing the operations part of setting up a potentially very complicated development environment for what you might be working on. How does that problem, if you guys have seen, gotten more difficult as you move to either supporting a bunch of different frameworks inside of PHP or into a lot of other languages that are now supported by Lando?
I mean, I think one of the things that we've been working on lately is, right now, like Lando's, I think the things that Lando does well are directly related to like let's call it the framework competency of its constituent maintainers.
Mm-hmm.
So like we come from the Drupal space primarily, but we also work in like WordPress and Laravel, and like the fact that Lando like is best at those things. So it makes sense that Lando is best at those things. But like that's like, one of the promises of Lando is that like you have this piece of technology that like over time Lando's a tool that wraps development, right? So like this is like necessarily like a very fluid sort of thing. Things will be changing, new things come out all the time, new frameworks come out all the time. Right. But like we want the interface that Lando provides to remain the same. So it's like we'll basically take care of like all these things that are changing for you, and like on your end, like maybe you got to bump the version every now and then, or like do a few other things. But like basically it's going to be the same over time. But like if we want that promise to happen for basically all things, which is what we want like Lando to do this for all kinds of frameworks, all kinds of languages. Like it's really important that we sort of transition Lando from what it is now, which is like this very monolithic, repository that has like different sort of recipes in it that like are, again, like linked to like our competencies, into basically like the NPM of development. Which is to say, like, we need to break Lando up into like much smaller components that like people can sort of like grab as they need, and that more importantly can be developed by whomever. Mm-hmm. Because like the breadth of Lando, if the breadth of Lando is always directly tied to like the three people who like primarily maintain it, then like its breadth will be limited. Right. We want its breadth to be all of development. So we need more people who have these experiences to contribute. So like it's very important that we make Lando much easier, much more modular, so that people who like Lando, but also know a little bit more about thing X can like bring thing X into Lando. And that's like a development process and a contribution process that's like easy and makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It's a big change to the way that you've been doing things up to this point. we've had a relationship, Platform and Lando, for quite a bit. I mean, now we're definitely going towards the point of sharing this modular view and trying to have more people on our team internally help with the integration that you have within Lando. But for a long time now, it's been a part of the mono repo. So what's that collaboration been like as a sort of maybe contrast? So we made a relationship a few years ago. How did the Platform Lando relationship come to be in the main mono repo generation of Lando?
Yeah, we've been talking about doing this for a long time. I mean, I think the initial person to like sort of bring this to, or try to make this happen was Aaron Porter, who I don't believe it, I think has moved on to new things. But yeah, I think he was pretty instrumental to like making this happen. And then Doug Goldberg, obviously, like very, very important as well. So yeah, I think it was a few years of just sort of chatting about it. And then I think once Platform realized how many people were using Lando, that was sort of the like watershed moment where it's like, okay, yeah, like this could be a way for us to like get local development, a development tool that's not the tools that we have that people like. But yeah, the integration, I mean, the Platform integration is like one of the harder things we've ever done because most of the integrations that we do, there's like 3 or 4 basic, or there's very, very, very finite set of combinations of things that can happen on the platform. It's like, okay, you can do Drupal, WordPress. Here's some like 4 or 5 things you can configure. Platform is not like that. Platform is basically like you can do whatever. So there's a kindred spirit there because that's sort of our mission as well. So yeah, it's been very interesting to do the platform integration, but it's been a lot of fun too. I mean, I think like early on when Florian and I were sort of looking at it, it was basically just like, is this even possible? And the answer is, I think it's mostly possible. But I think one of the challenges too has been just trying to get to feature complete. Right now the Lando integration with platform, it's great if you have a PHP only application. Yeah, basically that's it. Like it's great if you have a PHP only application because that's the only like language that we support right now. I think most of the services we support, but like it's very rare to have just a PHP application at this point. Like it's, you're gonna have Node and some other things. So I think that's like the big challenge for us going forward is sort of introduce some of these other languages into the integration so that's more successful. But Platform is the first. It is the first plugin that we've started to try to externalize. We're not quite done with that work yet. So you are also, I guess, patient zero. Well, maybe we shouldn't use patient zero anymore, but you are. This is the first time we're running the external experiment, so that's pretty exciting.
Sure, but this is the direction that shows the most promise. I mean, people are going to be able to then provide their own recipes as well as these external modules, along with any other tool they'd like to add to Lando.
Yeah, I mean, you can do that right now.
Yeah.
There is a plugin system, but it's not very good. And by not very good, I mean the documentation for how to do things is difficult, and it's not very easy to like install external plugins right now. So I feel like there's a lot of we're introducing some of the problems that we're claiming to be able to solve, that we're claiming that we're solving, right? It's just like, okay, like cool, like you can clone this repo down, but then if I have to run like 5 commands to install the plugins that I need before I run Lando start, it's like, what's the point? I've already like made this more complicated than I want it to be. So I think that's like the other big thing that we're doing is we want to split all these plugins out into their own places, but also have like some better tools around installing plugins automatically and that kind of thing. And just sort of reworking how the plugins themselves work. Because right now it's like you can do it, but I think it requires like a deeper knowledge of Lando. And some people have done that, and like congratulations to them for doing it. But I think we want to make it very, very easy. So it's like anyone can, like, if you can read, maybe like a page or 2 of documentation and like be able to like write a recipe in like 3 hours, like that's successful. So I think those are sort of the metrics that we have in mind. It's like you should be able to like make these things very quickly.
I feel like I'm a good case in point where I, for a lot of reasons, do not know as much about how Lando operates as Mike does. chief among them that I didn't write 99% of it. But being able to dive into the new platform plugin repo has been just night and day difference, where it just even having that narrowing of scope has been like, oh, hey, now like I know everything is here. I can kind of explore this area and master different pieces of it much more quickly than I would have if I had been like trying to kind of figure out how this thing works within the context of the mono repo.
Yeah, it makes sense. What's the community look like now in terms of sharing plugins or people contributing to the current installation method?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who, there are definitely people who have made plugins. I think some of them like come into the Slack and talk about them. I know like the Blackfire people have made a Lando plugin as well. I think there's like larger like enterprise organizations that like sort of maintain their own internal versions of these things that like, because they have very, very complicated stacks. So they have to like do more than what Lando can sort of do out of the box. Like we know that these things are happening, but there's no real centralized, sort of place where they live, but where people can find them. And more importantly, it's just difficult to install some of them. I think that's one of the goals of doing this is just make the whole thing a lot easier so that like, so the contribution can be easier. There are more people who can contribute, and like the artifact of their contribution will be like can be known in a way that's like makes a lot more sense.
I mean, like one thing that comes out to me is like contribution starts with using something, and if it's hard to use it, right? Like if it's hard to install a plugin, you're never going to create your own or modify an existing one. Really, you're just going to be, like right now you don't even know they exist, let alone know how to install it.
Yeah, and to that end, we've like for a long time we've had this like side tool called Hyperdrive. Its like original purpose was to aid in like basically the development of Lando. So it would help you install all the dependencies that you need to actually work on Lando itself. And we've like changed its scope recently to, we wanted to continue to do that. We wanted to basically provide like be a way to easily install the dependencies that Lando needs, but also to basically be a package manager. So we're working on Hyperdrive now as sort of like the yarn or the npm equivalent to Lando. So that's going to be the thing that that's going to be the thing behind the day or behind the scenes that I think is going to be doing a lot of the like, grabbing plugins and installing plugins and resolving them and installing dependencies and that kind of thing. So that's like a project that like probably will roll out in the next like month or two, which we think will be pretty cool.
Can you talk a little bit more about that long-term roadmap? That's coming out in a month. Like, what are some other things around Lando that you've got planned over the next 5 years, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, 5 years is far.
5 years is far.
I could give you 6 months.
Long.
I don't know. Maybe you got.
Well, actually, we do have 5 years, which is that like we want to have a like virtual reality, like AR.
Landoverse.
Minority Report
the Landoverse. Yeah, exactly. Where you can plug it into your brain and it'll just like never. So that's the far future, obviously. But yeah, for the next 6 months, less exciting than that, sadly. But yeah, we're moving towards doing a Lando 4 release, and like figuring out how to like sort of transition to that in a way that's like not going to ruin the lives of all the people who are currently using Lando. Has been like pretty interesting. So I think like some of the foundational pieces that we need before we can sort of get to like an alpha version of that are like the work that we're doing right now, which is to break up this mono repo into smaller plugins. I think that's pretty important. The next step after that will be like developing this Hyperdrive solution so that we have some way to like do dependency installation and plugin installation and those kinds of things. Those to me are like the two sort of foundational pieces. And once we have those in place, then I think we can start a Lando 4 project, and provide some like some ways for people to basically install it and like try it out. But one of the things that we're really trying to do, or that we think is very important, is we want like Lando 4 implies like a breaking change. I think we don't want the breaking change to be necessarily in the like Lando configuration file. We think that the breaking change will be elsewhere, which is to say that like we intend when there is like an initial Lando 4 release that like you can use it on like your current Lando files. It's just going to work a little bit differently. And in particular, like the things that like we want to bring to bear in Lando 4, one, I think like we can improve sort of like the commands and the interface around all of those things. I think that's one of the smaller changes. But the big changes I think are, improving sort of the build process that we have right now, which is like it works pretty good, but like if you're doing very complicated things, it can take a long time to do rebuilds and things like that. So I think like having that be a more foundational piece to Lando is pretty important. So that's number one. Number two is like Apple Silicon support is like a big pain. And like right now, if we were to introduce it in like Lando 3, like there's ways that we could do it, but I don't think that we could do it in a great way that would work for sort of all team members, which like sort of breaks the idea of Lando. Like if I have to like have a different one for this person than this person, then like what's the point? So like that'll be a big part, just like getting the M1 thing sort of sorted out, and that like actually like closely relates to the build step idea as well. Like those will both be required. Like the M1 thing will require the build step thing, I think. And then like we talked earlier about how like we view Lando as like as not just a local development solution, as like development solution. So I think the other thing there is sort of getting it prepped for usage in many environments, shall we say. And I think part of that will be how we do file sharing will be a huge part of that. Where the containers live, I think, would be a huge part of that as well. So
very cool. So you mentioned not just local dev, but other environments. I know VS Code recently announced they got a browser version. GitHub Codespaces and Gitpod announced a recent thing where you can develop remotely on the cloud and then deploy development environments immediately from there. So do you see that as a temporary thing, or do you see the community moving that way? And if so, how do you see Lando still fitting into that development picture?
I mean, like clearly the community is kind of already moving that way. It's interesting to like a lot of conversations I have now with people. It's like, yeah, we've been trying out, Gitpod. There's people deploying Lando on Gitpod.
Oh, okay.
People trying out GitHub Codespaces. So clearly there is a movement. And I think like, in Mike and I's experience, right, we've been watching this space for a while. This has happened before, right? These are not new ideas.
Right.
I mean, heck, like, you go back to like when most of us probably started coding, a lot of us were remotely coding, back in the aughts and the early teens.
Yep.
Like, you're just using Vim, right, on an SSHing into a server. So yeah, none of this is new. I do though feel like it feels more sticky. I don't know, Mike, like if you like, your kind of thoughts on like how you see that trend going.
Yeah, I do feel like there's been a few times where I feel like back in like 2015-ish, there was like another attempt to move a lot of development stuff to the cloud. And I feel like some people like that. But I feel like the vast majority of people, they're like, this is not like really ready for prime time. I do feel like the technology is a lot better now. And a lot of things are better now. I don't think that means that like in a year, everyone's going to be like working, on like a cloud development platform. But it does seem like that, like there's a like an increasingly significant percentage of people are going to be moving in that direction. We think basically that, there'll be three main ways that people are going to be doing development. One will basically be like all local, which is more or less the model that Lando supports right now. We think that some people will just do all cloud, where it's like, okay, I just like log into something on the internet, and it sort of approximates what I would do on my computer. So I've got an IDE, I've got a terminal, I've got some folders with some projects in them, and I'm running infrastructure of some kind to like power them. So in many ways, you can think about that as like if Lando were on some like DigitalOcean machine and I had some web UI around it that could launch some of these things, that would be sort of what it looks like. And then there's like this interesting middle space where I think is a lot of people are like sort of like interested in right now, where you have this like hybrid model where it's like I like continue to work on my computer, and for all intents and purposes, it feels the same as the totally local solution, except that the containers are running like in the cloud somewhere.
Gotcha.
So I think that those are like going to be the three main buckets that people choose for development. Certainly professional developers for the next 5 years, and I think that it'll basically just be a bleed from local towards cloud. But I think that one of the things that I think will give Lando an advantage if we are to move into that future is that like I don't think local is going to go away either. And if your goal is really to provide standardization to teams across many projects, like try to go to like a professional development team that has 20 software developers on it and tell all of them that they have to use this like predefined cloud-based solution for all their development. Good luck.
Developers are opinionated, it turns out. Like they really care about what tools they use. I don't know why that is, but they just care a lot. So.
There's all kinds of reasons why they're not going to want to do the cloud development, from like very like specific rational reasons to like fairly emotional reasons, which is just like I like my computer, I like don't feel comfortable with all of these things like on the internet. Like there's a lot of like very deep seated, I think, like emotional reasons for why you want to continue to like do it on your machine. And computers are getting a lot better too. I think that there might be some necessity like in the next like 5 to 10 years that you have to do it like in the cloud, because like applications have gotten so complicated and their requirements are so intense, and like the compute that you need is like the cloud is the only place where it makes sense to do that. There might be some future date where that like is like you just have to do it that way. But I don't know. I mean, like computers are also, laptops are getting a lot better too. So who knows?
It is interesting. I mean, like that last point, like the kind of edge computing for developers, I think is really interesting, because there's already like machine learning is like the biggest one that comes to mind for me, right? It's like, a lot of these tasks don't make sense to do locally, even if you do have, the M1, max 64 gigabytes of RAM, solution. It may not make sense to do a lot of that type of work locally. So yeah, and there's also a security picture, I think, that's coming out where this is kind of counterintuitive to me, but I think we might be heading towards a world where it may actually be more secure, or at least more reliable for your like enterprise security team if you work at a large organization, to think within a cloud context instead of securing local development for developers. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's I think that there's a lot of that too. Like I know like when we've done various like security questionnaires for some of the integrations that we do, just the fact that we're like have to download things like from a cloud like onto the computer, like that, right off the bat, that's like a huge problem, because like where you are becomes like very important. So like if I'm in Russia because my wife is Russian and I'm doing work, it's like there's some projects where I just like do not want to do that. I just do not want to risk doing that at all. I think that's it. But if you have a situation where it's like, we know that this development environment is like on our machine, like under lock and key in the basement somewhere, like I feel like that. And it's like always within our closed loop. And like, we have to like, the requirements to get access to it are like behind like well-known security measures, like VPNs and other things. Like that to me, I feel like that automatically checks a whole bunch of boxes, or at least like NAs a whole bunch of boxes. Which will make people who like to check boxes and NA boxes very happy.
I can see that point, and I could certainly see the point of seasoned developers being apprehensive about moving their development into the cloud. But what about people getting started for really the first time in an educational context? There's probably some future there, I would think.
I mean, that's actually kind of where the past of remote development is, I think, like for cloud development, right? Like the companies that seem like they've been at least somewhat successful have focused on that market. I feel like this is, if we're at a breakout moment for cloud-based development, it's that we're crossing that threshold away from the educational market. and moving towards professional developers, in my mind. Because there's a lot of really exciting solutions. I think like what is it, Replit is one of the, is a few years older than the newest generation, the Gitpod generation of things, and I believe that they focus a lot on the educational market.
Yeah, and I think that's like, I think to a large degree that's where the current, that's how I would describe most of the current like cloud-based development environments as well. Like it's, I think that they've run into these problems so in my mind, like in order for like a professional development team to adopt a cloud-based development solution, one, it's got to like run all your projects. Otherwise, like what's the point?
Right.
And right now, I think that's why you see people installing like Lando on Gitpod or DDev on Gitpod, because like you can only run like a fairly small subset of like actual projects on these things right now. Obviously, this is something that presumably they'll address, because I think that they're probably interested in that market. So I think that's like one of the characteristics that these things have to have. And the other one is that, like, again, like you're not going to be able to convince an entire team to wholesale adopt cloud development right off the bat. So like having additional ways that like you can do the development is going to be pretty important. So, I think that's where like Lando like potentially has like an interesting, it like is coming from an interesting space, because like we could already do the run most of your projects part. And in some ways, the local development part of the piece is like one of the harder problems. Like there's like sometimes it's we don't, because if you put a development environment in the cloud, you don't have to worry about like the more difficult things like scaling and monitoring and whatever. But it like solves a whole bunch of the difficult local development problems, which is like, how has the user messed up their machine, and how do I have to like work around that, right? Because like the cloud environment, it's just like, okay, like it's going to be this like pretty much every single time. We can guarantee like the combinations of things that can happen, but like it's really not true on like Bob or like Jackie's computer, who's like they've brew installed a bunch of stuff and then like hacked their permissions and then like installed some random application that like fundamentally breaks like something that we're expecting to be in the right place. Like those are the trickier problems, I think.
Right.
Alec, you mentioned earlier that Tandem was kind of spinning down.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like this is actually kind of one of the exciting things about what we're doing with Lando v4 and things. So, for a long time, we've bootstrapped Lando and basically funded Lando as an open source project through our agencies. And, Tandem was basically exclusively created for that purpose of sort of incubating Lando, I suppose, within its warm little shell. At this point, I think we do enough with Lando by itself, helping large enterprises adapt to Lando, working with folks like Platform, that we're really able to focus exclusively on Lando. And we noticed about half a year ago, we're like, hey, why are we still doing this agency thing? I think it's worn its usefulness out. So yeah, we're actually basically in the process of shutting down Tandem. You probably won't hear us talk really much more about Tandem unless it's a historical footnote going forward. I think we're a lot more excited about what's going on with Lando now and in the future.
Wow. So you're thinking about doing to fund Lando's open source project, then are you thinking about offering like enterprise service level agreements or support, or how are you looking at doing that?
I mean, it's kind of been an unsung story in Lando to this point, though we've done a lot of that. And we think that kind of just increased with the number of people that use Lando. There's a natural trajectory, right? Where one developer starts using Lando in an organization, they love it, they convert a few others, they love it. So now you have teams using it, and suddenly you're having different issues that they want to solve that aren't within the core use case. They want, support, what have you. And that's usually when we get a cold outreach, which has been great. No, that's led to a lot of really good relationships.
That's fantastic. Very cool.
What are some of those cases where Lando's been pushed outside of its principal use case, when you do have enterprise teams pushing it to the limit, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with more complicated infrastructure stacks at this point. Some of it too just goes back to a lot of what we've been talking about in this conversation, where the contributions landscape is a little bit more difficult. And I hope we're going to work ourselves a little bit out of a job here by making that easier. So a lot more enterprises will be able to adopt Lando and just do that self-service.
Okay.
But yeah, like a lot of that has been, we have an infrastructure stack that is in no way represented by the current Lando services because it's so custom. We have a larger development team that's maybe hundreds of developers. So getting that custom stack to work on all those people's computers and seeding that data that's coming from now multiple different sources, lots of different contexts for that. There's a lot of work that goes into that.
Yeah, and the work, like in particular, like is very similar to the work that we did with you all.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, like like at the end of the day, we're talking about like developing basically a plugin for these enterprise organizations that can allow them to do kind of the same things that that we do for Platform, which is like,
Right.
okay, they all have like notions of like, how do I authenticate, like one of my developers to like the set of things they possibly could do. Where are they getting like data? Like how are they generating seed data, or like grabbing data from somewhere? Are they grabbing files from somewhere? Like what sort of variations of like their stacks are possible? Because a lot of these large organizations, it's like they don't have just like one website that they're working on. They've got like a whole a whole landscape of websites. Each one of them is like very different, and some of them like share a lot of things in common too. So like they've got there are one organization that we did like has like a very like cool microservices type architecture where each app like spins up like all these different things, and they all have to sort of like connect together and talk together correctly. So like getting that all to sort of work out of the box with a simple command, it's very similar to what we did with Platform and any of our like sort of public, I guess, integrations.
Right. All right. Makes sense. So you mentioned that Lando v4 indicates a breaking change. We went through some of those details there. I mean, there's been some developments with the way Docker has changed. Has that influenced what v4 will be, or what you plan to do once we get into a more modular Lando and some of the other things that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, we've always looked at Docker as an implementation detail.
Sure.
That said, like it is a like very tightly baked implementation detail to the current version of Lando.
Right.
So I think like the goal for v4 is I think we want to make that part of Lando a lot more swappable, essentially. So like I don't think that like there's a good chance that that like Docker will remain like the underlying like default engine that powers a lot of what's happening here. But like I think it's highly likely that there will be other ones that people either make themselves or that like we will provide for people to use. So like Podman is like one of the more obvious I think ones that's out there right now. So, but I think that there's a good chance that like Lando will likely just adopt Docker's like language and syntax to describe all of its stuff. Okay. Particularly like Docker, the image generation itself, like that Docker file format, I feel like is fairly ubiquitous at this point. But yeah, I think that there's a good chance that by the end of next year, like you'll be able to use Podman instead of Docker. And like probably like Kubernetes as like your orchestration mechanism instead of Docker Compose. But like at the end of the day, like I think that developers don't give a shit about either of those things. Like it's like they want like, do I have the version of PHP that I need? Like, is Node installing these things correctly? Do I have like Xdebug? Can I connect to my site? Can like other developers spin my things up? Like. Yep. These are the like top of mind problems I think for most people. So, like I don't know. I think it would be cool if we could like do these other things, but like, is that just me thinking that it would be cool that we could like support other things, or is that like a serious problem that like people are feeling? Yeah, we'll see.
It reminds me of kind of of some of the relationships we have with our integration partners, where I think the reasons you care about those swappable layers in a lot of cases is production parity. It's like, oh yeah, like we run Kubernetes in production, so we want to make sure that like, you know, it's almost exactly the same here in our dev environments. And there's a level at which that matters, but that level oftentimes is actually a lot smaller than you would think. So some people care about that, some people don't.
My like at this point very strong opinion is that like if you think that like 100% production parity makes sense for development, then you don't understand what developers need. I mean, it's just like you're not like you're like if you are doing the exact same thing in production as you're doing in development, then like you've either reached some level of like evolved sensibility and like Zen state that allows you to do that, or you're just doing development differently than everybody else that I know. It's just like there are differences between production and development. So I think that like figuring out like, okay, what things do I need from production in order for me to successfully develop and then deploy to production is like the question, not like just some blanket dogma that like they've got to be exactly the same. And like we've known that like we've discovered this during the integration with Platform, where we like basically started from the assumption of like, okay, like let's just like run the exact Platform images that are running in production locally. And that like mostly worked, but like didn't completely work because I mean a very trivial example would be like, you know, like you're probably not running the same like node spin up command in production as you are. Like, are you doing hot reload on production? You know, like probably not, or vice versa. So like, you know, I think that it's like it doesn't take very far for you to like figure out like, oh yeah, like this is all good, but like these 5 things like like probably not like things that make sense for development. Like, do you want to do Drupal 8 settings permission hardening locally? I don't think so. So
I'm going to throw you a curveball.
Do it.
Ooh.
I've been using Lando for 3 years, and I still find things that I didn't know existed, features that are there that I had no idea. So is there a mind-blowing feature that's in Lando that most people aren't utilizing or don't know about that you think they should know about?
I'm curious to hear the answer to that.
There is a secret command that you can run. The command is called Lando 001. And if you run it, it'll do all of your work for you. And then it'll also like immediately Amazon order you some whiskey and send it to you next day or immediate delivery if possible.
Immediate delivery.
Yeah. I think the feature that I think the 2 features that I think people don't know about that they should know about. One of them is very trivial, which is that, or seemingly trivial, I guess, is that if you do a Lando rebuild, you can actually specify like what services you want to rebuild. So for example, if I have a very complicated app that makes use of lots of build steps, and I change one of the build steps for like service A, like I don't necessarily want to redo all the build steps for all the other services. I just want to like rebuild the one that I've changed. So like there's this like flag S option, and you can say, yeah, just rebuild the one that I changed. There you go.
There you go, Paul.
You did. You just blew my mind.
There you go, man.
Actually, like I would say like flag S is something I never really used, Mike, until I started working a lot more on Lando over the last few months. And it has been life changing. I do recommend that to anyone that uses Lando. Is like pretty much any Lando command you can target to like Lando logs. If you just want to see logs for a single service.
Yeah. See, I'd known about the logs and then SSHing into specific containers. I did not know I could say just rebuild this one thing.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the fact that we like that's one of the goals for Lando 4 really is just make that whole rebuilding process just like faster. So like at some point, I don't think that will even matter. It'll just sort of know that. Like, oh, like these things haven't changed, just like don't do anything. But for right now, I think that can save you a lot of time.
Yeah.
The other one is there's like this excludes functionality, which like I think some people don't know about, which is that like one of the most common problems with basically any like VM or container-based solution that requires you to like mount files into like a different VM has like slowness around the file sharing. And I think for Lando, it's like most notorious on Mac OS at this point. Linux is obviously very snappy because there's no VM. And if you use Windows with WSL, like sort of the same, especially if you directly connect with like VS Code or something. So this is like primarily a Mac problem at this point. And like for smaller applications, it's like not really that big a deal. But for like very big applications, like a big Drupal site that has like lots of modules and lots of like composer dependencies,
Right.
it can really start to slow things down. So, we have this basically file performance optimization mechanism called Excludes, which lets you basically just not file mount a bunch of directories. So like if you go in and you exclude like the node mod, like basic dependencies, like things that you're likely not going to need to edit. Node modules, vendor, whatever. Maybe some of the core, like if you're doing a Drupal site, like core Drupal modules, you can actually get like significant performance improvements.
It's just read only at that point inside the container, so it can still access it, but then it doesn't have the nice.
Yeah, it would become read only from the perspective of your host machine.
Right.
If you were to like SSH into it, you could write to it still. But yeah, it effectively decouples your host version of the file from the container version of the file. So yeah, so if you were to if you were to like install just like a Drupal 8 site, I guess Drupal 9 site, and exclude like vendor, and then like delete the vendor folder on your host, like it wouldn't matter. It'd still be there in the container. So
nice.
And that's another area that I think Lando 4 will provide a lot more flexibility around is file sharing and file mounting, because that's like still a big headache for a lot of people. And like I'm not going to rehash the long history of like us working on this and other people working on this, but our opinion basically is that like a lot of the other options that are currently available are just like you're always making some trade-off that's not ideal. So you're sacrificing speed for stability, or some other thing. But we think that there's a lot of like more interesting options now, especially with some of the things that you had talked about, Paul, with like VS Code being able to like directly connect to containers and stuff like that. So I think that like when Lando 4 comes out, there'll probably be like 4 or 5 different sort of options that you can pick for how you want to do the file sharing. So like just like copy files in and don't do anything, like maybe set up like an SSH or SFTP small little server so you can like directly connect, therefore no file sharing. Probably like this excludes thing that we're like talking about now will remain there. And then like I'm guessing like probably just like we might keep the default as what it is right now, which is like we'll just mount your folder in there. Right. You can sort of do it like that. So there'll be a lot of options.
Sweet.
Yep.
See, I already learned 2 new things then.
Well, I hate to start the wrap up, but we're at the top of the next hour. Is there anything that you guys would like to direct people's attention to, events you might be speaking at soon, or where they can get started with Lando?
Yeah, we don't have too much on the social calendar coming up here. It'll be nice to see in-person events start. Cross my fingers, like sometime in the next year, hopefully. But I think if you want to get started with Lando, definitely the best place to start. Go to lando.dev. The doc site is still a great resource. And be on the lookout. There will be some exciting announcements coming out, I think, about Lando v4. Cool. If you join our newsletter, which you can join if you go to lando.dev, that's oftentimes the best way, or just follow us on Twitter. Dev with Lando is the Twitter handle.
I want to share that link in the comments. Anything from you, Mike, before we sign off for today?
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's listening who's not using Lando should obviously give it a try.
Yes. Definitely.
Totally agreed.
Join the
Alec.
party.
Yeah. Alec, Mike, thank you so much for coming on. Mike, thanks for coming back on the show. Everybody, take care of yourself. Have a great weekend and join us next week for another episode of Deploy Friday.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all.